Claire, today at 11:00 a.m. my husband erased 3 years. The screen flashed, file not found. A blue glow chilled the room. Coffee sat cold on my desk, bitter and abandoned like me. $1,000,000. If you're listening, pause a second. What time is it where you are? And where are you listening from? Drop a comment and keep me company while I walk this ridge. I promise the truth will be worth your time today. Stay with me. Stay with me. Please answer both. I live in a small Oregon town where mornings smell like rain. Deadlines and second chances live here too. Today they collided. I climbed the stairs, warm from the library's radiator. My office door was half open. The cursor blinked over white. 180 pages. Photos. Slate-night footnotes, preserving small town history in digital archives. I knew every line. Now I had a white tombstone and a mocking message. File not found. Behind me wood creaked. Mark leaned on the frame like he owned air. He laughed once. Not loud, just enough to say he could. Leech, he said. You don't deserve a future. My jaw locked. Heat rose, then dropped. As I thought of tuition he stalled and jokes he told at parties, the way he called my classes a hobby while I folded laundry. My hands shook anyway. The mouse felt slick. The room tilted, precise and indifferent. I clicked recents. Empty. The trash. Empty. Search results. Empty. Silence spread across the room, heavy as wet wool. $. Maybe school isn't for you, he said, tracing my bookshelf. Maybe learn your place. He said it like a door closing. Did you touch my files? I asked. My voice held steady. He shrugged. It's our computer, our bills, our life. Grow up, I wanted to scream. I wanted the mug to shatter. Instead, I breathed once. Twice, I remembered something sacred. Lucy taught me autosave. Horse version history. Never forgets. I opened the browser. My fingers found a rehearsed path. Sign in. 2-step. A code on my phone. Another breath. Drive open like a door I built with every long night. $1,000,000. Folders stacked like little neighborhoods. There. Thesis master. A timeline of edits. Timestamps like breadcrumbs through the dark. He moved closer, reading the screen as if it was his. $1, you really think this matters? He asked, almost amused. It matters to me, I said. It tasted like iron and backbone. The latest copy weighed 37 minutes old. I clicked restore. Paragraphs returned like lungs refilling. References appeared. Captions slid into place. Names returned. I wanted to cry, but tears waste oxygen I needed. I took screenshots, activity logs. The open door, the clock. My phone camera clicked again. Proof is quiet, he smirked. Turn it in. Let's see who believes you. His cruelty used to knock the wind out of me. Not today. As I printed 2 chapters to check margins and spacing. Warm paper slid into my hands, smelling like possibility. The router hummed a steady, guilty note. The house felt cold. I thought about night shifts, missed movies, counted pennies. How many women lose futures to someone else's fear? How many are told to shrink, then blamed for disappearing? He blocked the doorway. Laws, a square of gray light behind him. You're wasting money we don't have, he said. Grow up, Claire. I looked at the ring groove on his finger, already pale. What if growing up means refusing to be erased? What if future means guarding the door myself? I checked citations, then cut 2 jittery sentences. The thesis was solid. My life could be too. A truck door slammed on the street. The house rattled. I made a choice. Not everything needs to be loud. Quiet can still carve stone. Quiet can move mountains. $. I saved the file again and copied it to a clean drive. The clock read 1:02 p.m. 98 minutes left. My hands steadied. My breath found a rhythm I knew. I picked up my bag, slid in the drive. Zipped it shut. I turned to him. I'm going now. My voice didn't wobble. He smiled like a man testing a fence. Sure you are. I stepped past him. My shoulder brushed the frame. The wood held. $. On the porch, rain smelled like iron and soil and green. The sky hung low, the way it does before a storm decides. I pulled my hood tight and walked toward the car, steady. I kept walking. She did $1,000,000 because endurance is sometimes the loudest answer. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. When I came back, something would be waiting, colder than rain. Tell me what you would do in my place. A. Call the police. B. Act calm and gather proof. I didn't always live in the blue light of deadlines. Before the clock ruled me, the library did. $1,000,000. The town smelled like rain and sawdust today. I shelved returns by call number, humming under my breath. The radiators clanged to life, then settled into a low purr. Lucy found me at the reference desk that first fall. She slid a coffee across, extra hot, extra kind. You look like someone chasing a moving target, she said. I am, I said. A. Masters in Information Management. Her eyebrows lifted. Good, make it real. Build the future here. She meant our town, our people, our fading photo albums. Nights the library emptied. $1,000,000. I stayed and scanned marriage records, brittle as sugar. My gloves squeaked against the glass, careful with each name. At home the boys dropped backpacks and sports gear. Roz, they dollars. They asked for dinner and rides and clean jerseys. I said yes, mostly because love wants to be useful. Mark came in later, smelling like cedar and concrete dust. He didn't hate my dream at first. Ballers, he just looked at his boots and changed the subject. On Tuesdays, I drove to campus after closing. The highway unwound through wet pines and low clouds. In the lecture hall, Dean Phillips paced like a metronome. He asked for rigor, for sources, for structure. He circled the word context on my draft. Twice. Keep the human thread, he said. Dollars, data is not memory. I took it to heart. I interviewed museum volunteers and the oldest barber in town. Bean and Leaf became my second home. The espresso hissed, the windows steamed in winter. Dollars, I wrote until the night crew stacked chairs. Mark complained the house felt empty. Then he asked about groceries and the mortgage. I told him the budget every time in plain numbers. $1 million. He started calling school my hobby that second winter. He said it when we argued about a broken water heater. He said it after a party when I drove us both home. I learned to study with earplugs. I learned to line my sentences with steel. But I also learned to let Lucy in. She gave me a password notebook, hardbound and red. Never let your future live on one device, she said. $1 million. We sat in her kitchen while bread cooled on the counter. Her window looked over a rain shiny street. We tested two-factor logins and automatic backups. I set restore points like mile markers in fog. Stars, the thesis grew muscle slowly, interviews layered with maps and photographs, careful and precise. I traced the old mill and a vanished laundromat on Main. Dean sent back notes in margin green. Clarity here, he wrote. Let the town breathe. I breathed and cut and kept writing. Sometimes the boys helped scan flyers after practice. We argued about metadata and extra credit. $1 million, they laughed when I bribed them with milkshakes. I thought we were building something together. A house, a map, a record, a future. Maybe that was naive. Maybe it was necessary. Bean and Leaf stayed open late on Thursdays. The rain tapped hard against the big front window. Steam rose from my mug, curling into the lamplight. I spread notes across the table. Was each page weighted with a pen? Old photos curled at the edges, faces fading into sepia fog. The hiss of the espresso machine steadied my pulse. Outside, headlights streaked through puddles. Inside, I stitched together a paragraph about the town's first firehouse. Lucy dropped into the chair opposite, coat damp from the walk. She handed me a flash drive in a plastic sleeve. So encrypted, she said. Keep it on you, not in the desk. I slid it into my bag, feeling its small, certain weight. By the second spring, Mark's questions turned sharper. Why do you need more ink already? Why is the library giving you special shifts? He offered to handle the tuition payments. A week later, the statement showed a late fee. When I asked, $1 million, he said the check must have crossed in the mail. I started keeping digital receipts and paper copies. Lucy showed me how to sync them to the cloud, naming each file like a breadcrumb in the dark. She didn't know dollars. Some nights I worked from her kitchen table instead. The bread smell clung to my sweater on the drive home. I could think there without footsteps behind me. Mark noticed. Odd again, he'd say, eyes on the television, remote still in hand. He didn't ask about the work, he asked about dinner. I learned to answer plainly and move on. The less explained, the less he could twist. Still, $1 million, the air at home thickened in small, invisible ways. The boys sensed it too. They'd retreat to their rooms early, headphones in place. I tried to fill the silence with typing, not questions. A month before submission, I found the first missing file. It was an appendix, nothing critical yet but gone. The folder log showed it had been accessed mid-afternoon. When I mentioned it, Mark shrugged. Computers glitch, you back things up, right? His smile didn't reach his eyes. That night I triple-checked every backup. I bought another drive, labeled it in red ink. Lucy laughed softly but didn't tell me I was overreacting. By then, the thesis felt less like paper and more like proof. Proof I could finish what I started. Followers, proof I could build something no one else could erase. Rain softened to a mist outside the cafe windows. I closed my laptop and slipped the drive into my pocket. Even then, a thought sat heavy at the base of my throat. He tried to stop me before. Quietly, the kitchen smelled of damp wood and reheated stew. Rain slid down the back window in crooked lines. Mark stood by the counter, swirling ice in a glass. He didn't look up when I came in. You're late, he said, voice flat as the tabletop. I had to scan city records. I answered. We're setting my bag down. He tapped the rim of his glass with a spoon. The chime was sharp, deliberate. School's a hobby, Claire, not a job. The words dropped heavy into the room. Somewhere outside, a car splashed through a puddle. Inside, the clock above the stove ticked slow, steady beats. I reached for a dish towel, more to keep my hands busy. You've said that before, I murmured. And I'll keep saying it until you listen. He moved to the fridge, pulled out the milk. The door slammed harder than needed. A faint vibration passed through the floorboards. $5 million. You think you'll fix things? He asked. Maybe it'll fix the way you see me, I said, still facing the sink, staring at the steam on the window. He laughed once, a sound with no warmth. $1 million. You're chasing a title. I'm paying for a life. The fridge motor kicked on, a low hum between us. I pictured Lucy's kitchen, quiet but for the bread knife. There, I never had to measure every word. Here, each sentence felt like walking on glass. Mark poured the milk into his glass, over melting ice. Dean Phillips call you again? He asked. Feedback on Chapter 5, I said. It's stronger now. He shook his head. Stronger isn't paid. Though the words were clipped, almost clinical. I thought about the tuition payment delay. Dollars, the missing appendix file, the late fee that shouldn't exist. He leaned against the counter, arms folded. You could work more hours at the library, he said. $1 million. Classes will still be there next year. Steam from the pot fogged my glasses. I wiped them on my sleeve, blinking into clarity. Next year would mean starting over. That wasn't happening. For hearing dollars, you're not hearing me, I said quietly. He smirked like he'd won a small point. I hear you. I just know better. The rain thickened, drumming the roof. $1 million. I could smell the sharp tang of wet leaves through the screen door. In that sound, I hit a small decision. I'd keep every receipt, every file, every note from now on. Smalls. Mark finished his drink in 2 swallows. He set the glass down hard enough to rattle the silverware. You'll thank me someday, he said, walking out. I stayed in the kitchen. $5 million. Listening to his steps fade, the clock ticked on, the pot bubbled, and I realized this wasn't about school anymore. It wasn't the first time he'd cut me down. $1 million. I could trace the pattern like cracks in old plaster. At a neighbor's barbecue last summer, I'd mentioned my thesis to a woman from the city council. Mark leaned in, beer in hand, and said, Marcellus Prezio, don't get her started. She'll bore you to death with library talk. The smell of lighter fluid and charred meat stuck in my hair. Laughter rolled across the yard, but not the good kind. Worse, $1 million. I remember keeping my smile fixed, watching the condensation slip down my paper cup. Later that week, he interrupted a call from Dean. I was in the living room, pen poised over my notes. Mark strode in, tossed his keys onto the coffee table. The sharp clink startled me enough to drop my pen. Still on that, he said loud enough for Dean to hear. We're for $5 million. I tried to steer the conversation back to methodology. Dean paused, then cleared his throat, offering to email instead so I could handle things at home, in quieter moments. In dollars. The jabs came softer but cut deeper, passing in the hallway. You'd look better with more sleep. Oh, over breakfast. You don't need to improve anything, you know. Even in front of the boys. $1 million. He'd make jokes about me, playing student, while real work waited. The boys laughed nervously, eyes darting to mine, as if checking whether I'd laugh too. Some nights, I'd retreat to the upstairs office, closing the door just enough to signal I needed space. The desk lamp pulled warm light over my keyboard. Outside, what she'd in $1 million, the wind moved through the pine trees like a slow tide. I typed with a steady rhythm, each word a small defiance against the undertow pulling me back. The hum of the heater, a worth $5 million, the faint scent of coffee grounds, his little anchors to keep me from drifting into his version of reality. But the ground was shifting. The missing appendix file wasn't random. $1 million, the late tuition payment wasn't an oversight. I could feel it in the way his questions lingered too long, the way his eyes followed me when I logged in. One night, coming down the stairs, Malia was in $5. I caught the end of his phone call. He was in the front hall, leaning against the coat rack. His voice was low, but his tone held that familiar smirk. Yeah, she's still at it. Don't worry. He looked up then, surprised to see me. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then the corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile, but something practiced. $1 million. He slipped his phone into his pocket, thumb moving quick over the screen as he walked past. I stood there, the chill from the open door sliding under my sleeves. $1 million, knowing he'd just sent a message I wasn't meant to see. The ATM beeped 3 times before the message. Oh Lord, balance of Yallard. The number sat there clean and merciless in green digits. $1 worse. Cold air slipped through the vestibule's glass door. I could smell damp concrete and the faint scent of rubber mats. Behind me, someone cleared their throat, so I stepped aside, Aller's screen still burning in my mind. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the street slick. Puddles mirrored the gray sky and the bank's neon sign. I walked to my car, keys biting into my palm. $1 million. In the driver's seat, I pulled up the account on my phone. Transactions scrolled past, grocery store, gas station, and then a single withdrawal larger than our mortgage payment. The timestamp was mid-morning, the same time I'd been in class, arguing with the printer over paper jams. I called the bank from the parking lot. The hold music was tinny. Was too cheerful for the knot in my chest. When a teller finally answered, her voice softened as she explained the withdrawal was in person. No fraud alert, no double check. $5 million because the signature matched one already on file. Marks. The windshield fogged from my breath. I wiped it clear with my sleeve. $1 million watching the bank's glass doors open and close like a slow metronome. The teller suggested I come in to review the paperwork. Her tone was polite, but the subtext was clear. $1 million, this wasn't a mistake. Inside, the bank smelled of carpet cleaner and paper. The manager led me to a cubicle with a partition too short for privacy. She slid the withdrawal slip across the desk. Mark's handwriting looped across the page, bold and certain in blue ink. Was this discussed between you? She asked, as if the answer would change the facts. I shook my head. $1 million worth. A joint account. She reminded me it's legal for either party to withdraw. Legal didn't mean harmless. Legal didn't mean right. By the time I walked back to the car, $1 million, my mind was already breaking the day into steps. Call Lucy. Print bank statements. Separate account. The rain began again, soft enough to sound like static against the roof. I turned the key. The engine catching with a low rumble. In the rear view, the bank's facade blurred with each drop. Driving home, I passed the Bean and Leaf. I almost stopped. $5 million, but the thought of explaining this out loud felt too raw. Better to keep it small for now, something I could fold into a file and hide until I needed it. At home, $1 million. The house was quiet except for the dryer, steady hum. I laid the withdrawal slip on my desk, next to the red notebook Lucy had given me. The pen felt heavier than usual in my hand as I wrote the date, the amount, and one word in the margin pattern. Because that's what it was now. Not random, not careless. Pattern. Mark came in just after dark, boots leaving wet prints on the mat. He dropped his jacket on a chair, the sleeves still dripping. You're home early, he said, as if testing the air. $5 million. I held the withdrawal slip between two fingers. Want to tell me about this? The blue ink light from the overhead fixture. He glanced at it, then at me, expression unreadable. When needed cash, he said. The credit cards due. His voice was calm, almost bored. That's not what we agreed, I said. $1 million. We talked before large withdrawals. He smirked like as I'd told him a bedtime rule he'd outgrown. It's a joint account, Claire. Remember, I earn the money. As you shuffle it around. The word slid out smooth, no raised voice, no hurry. I felt the floor steady under me, the way it does before a storm. Joint means equal say? I said quietly. It's not equal access to ruin the plan. He shrugged, bending to untie his boots. Water dripped onto the hardwood, spreading in slow circles. You overthink everything. It's not a big deal. I let the silence sit until he looked up. Then I set the slip on the table beside his keys. From now on, I'll handle my part separately. His eyes narrowed a fraction. You hiding something? No, I said. I'm protecting something. Later, upstairs, I opened my laptop. The glow lit the red notebook beside it. I logged into my personal email. Clicked through to the bank site and opened a new account in my name only. The form asked for a funding source. I linked my library paycheck, small but steady, and moved what I could from my personal savings. In the margin of the notebook, I wrote another date, another note account opened, underlined twice. $1 million. I printed the last 3 months of statements from the joint account. The printer's hum filled the room like a low warning. Each page slid out warm, another piece of the pattern in my hands. $1 million downstairs, the television muttered in the living room. Mark laughed at something, short, sharp, automatic. I wondered if he laughed the same way when he handed that slip to the teller. $1 million. I slid the statements into a folder, added the withdrawal slip to the front, and tucked it into the locked file box under my desk. The house smelled faintly of his aftershave. $5 million, mingled with the sharp scent of printer ink. It made me think of signatures on papers I never saw. I closed the laptop, listened to the rain start again against the gutters. Was Fowler as my hand rested on the file box, feeling its weight. What else had he taken? The invitation stopped coming slowly, like a tap turning off. First it was a neighbor's dinner, then a weekend hike. By winter, the group texts went quiet unless I started them. When I ran into Marcy at the grocery store, she smiled too brightly and checked her watch twice. Busy with the kids, she said. Swiss, her cart already turned toward the next aisle. Even at church, the pew beside me stayed empty. I told myself it was coincidence, but the glances passed between people said otherwise. At home, $5 million. When it was a phone rang less. When it did, it was a robocall or the library schedule. Mark never mentioned friends, but I noticed his evenings out lined up with their gatherings. Lucy noticed too. Was one Thursday, she found me in the library's back room, sorting donated books that smelled of mildew and basement air. People pulling away, she asked, voice low. I nodded without looking up. Let them, she said. You've got bigger work to do. She handed me a thumb drive and a sealed envelope. Backups here. $1 million and instructions if you need to work from another machine. We sat at the staff computer after closing. The hum of the heater filled the quiet. She walked me through encrypting files, uploading them to a secure folder only I could access. Passwords change every 90 days, she reminded me. Don't store them on your phone. Outside, snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes. $5 million, it caught in the streetlights, turning the parking lot into a slow-motion photograph. I saved the latest draft, watched the progress bar fill like a breath I could finally take. Lucy leaned over my shoulder, checked the settings twice before nodding. You're not just writing a thesis, she said. $1. You're building a record no one can rewrite. The words stayed with me on the drive home. The heater wheezed against the cold, and the windshield wipers kept time with my thoughts. At home, the house was dark except for the kitchen light. A plate of leftovers sat on the counter under plastic wrap. Mark's note read, "Out late, don't wait up." I ate standing at the counter. $5 million, listening to the faint tick of the wall clock. The quiet pressed in, but it wasn't entirely unwelcome. It gave me space to think, to picture the folders tucked away on Lucy's drive, safe from any sudden power cut or prying hands. Later, upstairs, I checked the autosave logs. Every file was there, time-stamped and neat. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders eased. What she'd worth $5 million. I didn't know if the distance from friends was his doing, or if they'd just decided my life was too messy to touch. Either way, I wasn't going to chase them. I had proof to protect and a story to finish. Saturday morning, the library was quiet except for the hum of the HVAC. Snow from the night before still clung to the windowsills. $1 million, Ras casting a dull light across the reading tables. Lucy came in through the staff door with 2 coffees. She set one beside my laptop, the heat of it warming my chilled fingers. Time for a fire drill, she said. We moved to the back office where the spare desktop sat. It smelled faintly of toner and lemon cleaner. Lucy slid the thumb drive into the port, its plastic casing nicked from years of use. Pick a file, she said. Something important but safe to test. I chose a chapter draft from 2 weeks ago, the one with the oral history from Mr. Go. Dalton about the old mill. We copied it to the desktop, then deleted it. The empty folder looked like an open mouth. Lucy clicked through the recovery steps slowly. Her finger tapping the desk in time with the progress bar. A few seconds later, the file reappeared. The name, the date, every word intact. I opened it. Was worth $5 million. Reading the furries as if they were proof of oxygen. Mr. Dalton's voice lived there again. With the creak of his porch swing, the smell of his wood stove, the way he paused before talking about the flood of '62. You see, Lucy said, they can't take what you can restore. Her smile was steady, not the bright. I was worth $5 million. Brittle kind people give when they're only half sure. This was conviction. I saved the file back to the drive, feeling a small current of control hum through me. The tightness between my shoulder blades loosened, just enough to notice the relief. We sat for a moment in the low light, the radiator knocking in the corner. Lucy sipped her coffee and watched the snow flurries start again. You've got more than words now, she said. You've got proof. And a way to keep it? Driving home, IOs were $1 million. The roads were rose wet and dark from melting snow. The air smelled of pine and exhaust. Each turn of the tires felt deliberate, as if the car knew I was carrying something fragile. At the house, $1. Mark's truck was gone. The living room lamp was still on, casting a small island of light over the couch. I dropped my bag beside the desk, resisting the urge to check the files again. Instead, what she didn't $1 million. I looked out the window toward the street, snow running in thin streams along the curb. For the first time in weeks, I felt the shape of a plan that wasn't all defense. $1 million. If the autosave worked, I still had a shot. The smell of charcoal hit me before I reached the backyard. It clung to the cold air, heavy with grilled meat and sweet barbecue sauce. Mark's crew had gathered around a long folding table, plastic cups in hand, laughter rising in uneven bursts. A string of yellow bulbs hung from the eaves, casting soft pools of light onto the patchy grass. Someone had set a speaker on the porch railing, classic rock hummed under the voices. Mark spotted me from across the yard. He was standing with 2 men in dusty work boots, a beer bottle tilted loosely in his hand. He grinned, but it wasn't for me. Here's the scholar, he called out, loud enough to turn heads. Conversations paused. A few people smiled uncertainly. I kept walking, clutching the pie I'd baked that morning, its foil top warm against my palms. Mark stepped forward, was blocking my path to the table. Tell them what you're writing about, he said. His tone was too bright, the kind you use when baiting a hook. It's $1. It's about preserving small-town history in digital archives, I said. I kept my voice steady, though I could feel the heat from the grill mixing with the cold creeping under my coat sleeves. $. Sounds thrilling. One of the men said, the sarcasm hidden just enough to pass as polite. Mark laughed, tipping his head back. Don't let her fool you, she's just avoiding real work. A ripple of chuckles moved through the group. The pie felt heavier in my hands. Behind me the grill popped, sending up a puff of smoke. $1 million. I set the pie down on the table, the full crinkling under my fingers. Someone asked about deadlines, and before I could answer, Mark cut in. Deadlines, he said. She's got more extensions than a bad contractor. This time the laughter was louder. The speaker skipped, then caught the beat again. I caught sight of a woman near the porch. Worth $5 million, her phone angled slightly toward us, screen glowing against her sweater. She wasn't smiling. The paper plates rattled in their stack as a breeze passed through. I stepped back, giving myself a little space. Mark moved closer, lowering his voice just enough for me to hear. Lighten up, Claire. They're just jokes. But they weren't. Each word was a small extraction. What she didn't have $1 million, a way to chip at the edges of the life I was building. I picked up a cup of water from the drinks table. The ice clinked sharply, and for a moment, whereas all I could hear was the fizz from a nearby soda can, Mark turned back to his friends, launching into a story about a job site mishap. Their laughter rose again. Boys worth $5,000, but my focus stayed on the woman with the phone. She slipped it into her pocket, glancing once at me before heading toward the house. I memorized her face, the shape of the porch light on her hair. $1 million. The smoke from the grill thickened, curling into my scarf and settling there. I knew the smell would follow me home, just like the words I couldn't shake. Mark wasn't finished. Dollars. After the story about the job site, he waved a hand in my direction. She's been working on this paper for 3 years now. He let the pause stretch, waiting for someone to bite. Dollars. A master's degree takes time, I said evenly. Especially when you're balancing work and family. It was the truth, but my words landed in a pocket of silence. I was full as then someone near the grill chuckled. Sounds like you've got a full-time student and a part-time wife. A laughter followed, sharper this time, no longer masked. The $5 million, what? The woman with the phone had reappeared near the back steps. She was leaning against the railing now, her screen angled slightly, her thumb tapping. I wondered if she was recording again. Mark grinned at the joke, lifting his bottle in mock salute. Hey, if she ever finishes, maybe she can archive our barbecues. More laughter. Even the music seemed to drop to let it through. $5 million. I took a sip of water, the ice pressing against my lips, and thought about how the moment would look on playback. The angle of the camera, the expressions. So the way I stood still while they spoke over me. Come on, Claire, say something, Mark urged. He was enjoying the spotlight, his voice warm and coaxing for the audience. Dollars, but to edge it with the bite I knew too well. I set my cup down on the drinks table. No need, I said. You've covered it. It was calm, not defensive, and for a heartbeat the yard went quiet. $1 million. Mark tilted his head, measuring me. Then he laughed again, a sound that pulled the others back into easy chatter. He turned away, clinking bottles with one of the crew. Dollars. I caught the woman's gaze just before she slipped inside the house. Her mouth was set, eyes unreadable. Whatever she had, it was mine to remember. The grill smoke drifted toward the fence. I was worth $1 million, carrying the scent of charred ribs and lighter fluid. It tangled in my hair, clinging like the weight in my chest. I stepped back from the circle, passing the table where the pie sat untouched. $1 million. My fingers brushed the foil, and I knew I wouldn't take it with me. The grass was damp under my boots as I crossed to the gate. Behind me, voices rose and fell. $1 million, punctuated by bursts of laughter that no longer stung, only confirmed what I already knew. On the sidewalk the air was cooler, the night quieter except for the low hum of street lamps. $1 million. I walked without looking back, the echo of their words fading into the rhythm of my steps. By the time I reached my car, the knot in my throat had settled into something harder. $1 million, something I could store with the rest of my evidence. I started the engine, the headlights cutting a path through the dark. As the yard disappeared in the rearview, worth $5 million, I knew this night wouldn't just be a memory, it would be a record. Too far or deserved. The morning after the barbecue, the house felt too still. Mark had already left. His boots were gone from the mat. The smell of last night's smoke lingered in my hair and coat. I made coffee, the bitter scent filling the kitchen, and carried the mug upstairs to my desk. $1 million as the laptop's screen glowed in the dim room, a quiet hum under the steady tick of the wall clock. Google Drive loaded slowly, the progress wheel turning. I clicked on the thesis folder. $, the titles of each chapter stacked neatly in the list. Everything looked as it should. At first, then I opened the version history, a thin pane slid open on the right, 8 lines of edits marching down by date and time. One stood out: a deletion at 2:14 p.m. last Thursday. That was when I'd been shelving books at the library. I should have known Mardalas the same afternoon. Mark had texted me to ask if I'd be home for dinner. I hovered over the timestamp, my pulse loud in my ears. The details expanded: same file name, same user, Ply was Valos, and the IP address matched our home network. It felt like the floor dropped an inch. My fingers tightened around the mouse, and I read the line again, slower this time, just as if the meaning might change. I took a screenshot. The shutter sound was small but sharp in the quiet room. Then another from a different angle, showing the full path and my username. Proof. Not suspicion. Proof. I scrolled further back and found more. 2 minor edits removed entire paragraphs, both in sections I'd rewritten after Lucy's advice. The changes were subtle. $1 million, the kind that could be blamed on error or glitch, but they weren't errors. I could see the pattern now. Each changed time for when I wasn't home. I printed the history log. The warm paper sliding into my hand. The smell of toner mixed the faint sweetness of my coffee. For a moment I just sat there. The papers fanned out on the desk. $1 million, sunlight creeping across the floorboards. The evidence was as plain as the grain in the wood. I opened my email and drafted a message to Lucy. Subject: backup copy. Urgent. So I attached the latest thesis file, then zipped the screenshots and the PDF of the log. My fingers hesitated over the send button. The doorbell rang downstairs. Where's $1 million? It startled me enough that the cursor jumped in the text box. I ignored it, listening to the muffled sound of someone walking away on the porch. Probably a delivery. I hit send. I froze into dollars. The whoosh of the email leaving felt like a small exhale. Then I saved the attachments to the encrypted drive Lucy had given me. The clock read 9:47 a.m. The day outside was cold and bright. Sunlight sharp on the frost edging the front lawn. Inside, the air felt heavier, as if the house knew its own walls had been turned into a witness. I stayed at the desk, scrolling further down the version history. Each click felt heavier, as if I were pulling up roots. More edits appeared, small deletions, swapped words, references dropped without reason. $1 million, the earliest, went back almost 2 months. On a Tuesday night, whole citations vanished from Chapter 3. That night I'd been at a council meeting with Lucy. Worth $50 speaking about the library's funding. Another edit was timestamped at 6:12 a.m., the week I'd been too sick to get out of bed before 9. $1 million, $5 million. I remembered hearing the creak of the office chair upstairs, Mark claiming he was paying bills. I printed each suspicious entry, the stack of paper growing into a record of intent. $1 million, with the smell of warm toner thickened in the room. I wrote dates in the margins, matching them with my calendar entries. The pattern was too precise to dismiss. He wasn't just curious, he was undermining me. Quietly, deliberately. My phone buzzed on the desk, a text from Mark: need anything from town. I stared at it, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Worse filers. As I typed, no thanks, then deleted it. Typed we're fine, then deleted that too. Finally, I put the phone face down and didn't reply. Silence can be its own kind of shield. $1 million. I opened a blank document and began a timeline. Not just the changes, but every moment they tied to where I was, what he said later, how the missing pieces fit into his comments about my work. Worth $5 million. The more I wrote, the calmer I felt. This wasn't paranoia, it was documentation. I encrypted the file, then uploaded a copy to the secure folder Lucy had set up. The progress bar crawled to completion. Another copy went to the thumb drive in my desk drawer. Downstairs, the front door opened and closed. Mark's footsteps moved through the living room, steady, unhurried. I could smell the sharp scent of cold air he brought in. I closed the laptop, stacked the printed logs into a manila envelope, $1 million, and slid it under a pile of old newspapers in the bottom drawer. The lock clicked softly into place. When he came up to the office, I was leaning back in my chair, coffee cup in hand, as if I'd spent the morning lost in thought. Working hard? He asked, eyes flicking to the closed laptop. Just reviewing, I said. My voice was level, almost casual. He nodded once. I was worth $5 million, and for a moment I wondered if he knew I knew. But he only stepped back into the hall, whistling under his breath. I waited until I heard the shower start before opening the laptop again. There was nothing more to find today. Everything was saved, twice over, exactly where I needed it to be. Tomorrow is submission day. The house was silent except for the low hum of the heater. Midnight had come and gone, but the glow from my desk lamp still cut a small circle in the dark. Pages were spread across the table, edges curling slightly from the warmth of the lamp. She didn't know it was worth $5 million. The scent of black coffee mingled with the faint smell of rain blowing in through the cracked window. My father's words kept threading through my thoughts. $5 million from a night years ago when I almost quit college. Future is earned, Claire. And once you've built it, you protect it. I could still hear the rasp in his voice. $1 million Oz. The way his hands then rested on the back of my chair, I read through chapter 7 again, eyes tracking each citation, fingers pausing on any line that felt weaker than it should. Wordsworth, $5 million. The cursor blinked patiently in the margin notes. Somewhere down the street, a car door closed, the sound carrying in the cold air. It faded quickly, leaving only the faint tick of the wall clock. Buy was worth $5. I highlighted a paragraph on the town's first newspaper office, adjusting the phrasing until it matched the tone I'd set earlier. Each small fix felt like tightening a knot, securing the work against any fraying edge. Beside me, the encrypted drive's indicator light pulsed steadily. Every hour, I saved the file again, then mirrored it to the cloud folder. The progress bars had become my lifeline, with small proof that nothing was slipping away tonight. The clock read 1:37 a.m. My eyes burned, but the words on the page still held their shape. $1 million. I took a sip of coffee gone lukewarm, the bitterness waking me just enough to keep moving. Rain began tapping against the window, soft at first, then harder. $1 million. A rhythm that matched the beat of the keys under my fingers. I leaned back, rolling my shoulders, feeling the ache that had settled there weeks ago. The printer hummed to life. $1 billion. Spitting out the latest round of edits, I stacked the warm pages carefully, the scent of toner sharp in the air. Somewhere below, the floor creaked. I froze, listening. Zwoosh, but no footsteps followed, just the house settling into the night. I turned back to the screen, checking the version history one last time. No new edits but mine. The clean log was almost as satisfying as the words themselves. By 20:15 a.m., the final bibliography was polished. Names spelled right, page numbers in place, links tested and unbroken. Well, as I leaned forward, elbows on the desk, looking at the title page, 3 years distilled into one line in bold type. It didn't feel like just a thesis anymore. $1 million. It felt like a map out of the shadow I'd been living in. By 3 o'clock, the rain had slowed to a mist. The air in the room felt heavy, warm from the lamp and the steady churn of my focus. I ran the spell, check one last time, catching 2 stray words hiding in the margins. Beside the laptop, $1 million. A half-filled legal pad held my backup plan, the bullet points for a cover letter explaining the structure if anyone questioned it. Every sentence in that letter was careful, professional but firm. Must have in those dollars if I were already defending my work. I saved the thesis again, watching the progress bar crawl from left to right. Then I mirrored it to the encrypted drive. $1. The indicator light blinking in its slow, steady pulse. The printer came to life, rolling out the final copy for review. The smell of warm paper filled the room. And I let my hands rest on the stack for a moment, feeling the faint vibration still in the pages. At 8:45 a.m., sunlight crept through the blinds, laying pale stripes across the desk. I stretched. $1 million, every joint in my back and shoulders protesting. Downstairs, the kettle whistled was, I'd set it on autopilot earlier, a small act of kindness for myself. I packed the drive into a padded sleeve. $5 million, slipped the legal pad and printed thesis into my bag and zipped it shut. The weight of it was solid, the kind of weight that says this exists. Mark's truck was still gone. The house held its silence like a held breath. I locked the front door behind me, stepping into air that smelled faintly of wet earth. The drive to campus was quiet. The road shimmered in patches where the sun had broken through. My 5 fingers tapped against the steering wheel, keeping time with the low hum of the tires on asphalt. At the faculty office, $1 million. I signed my name in the logbook, my pen leaving a small flourish on the final stroke. The clerk took the flash drive and printed copy, checking them off against the submission form. "That's it?" I asked. She smiled. "That's it, you're early, actually." I glanced at clock, 2:41 p.m. 99 minutes before the deadline. Outside, the $5 million, the breeze felt different. The cooler, cleaner, as if the air had been waiting for this moment too. I sat in the car, hands loose on the steering wheel, and pulled out my phone. An email notification slid across the screen. From Dean Phillips. Subject received. I opened it. One line waited for me there. "Suv, see you at defense." The knot between my ribs loosened just enough to breathe. The morning after submission, the house still smelled of rain. I woke before sunrise. $1 million, might already assembling a list. Wait, not revisions, not research, this was a different kind of work. At the kitchen table, I dialed a number Lucy had given me weeks ago. The phone rang twice before a calm voice answered. "Harper and Leeds, Family Law." I gave my name and asked for a consultation. The receptionist's tone stayed neutral. $1 million. But her efficiency told me she'd had this kind of call before. We set a meeting for Thursday morning. At the library, I moved through my shift like muscle memory. Reshelving returns. $5 million, helping a patron with the printer, accepting a donation of books that smelled faintly of attic dust. In the back room, I opened the staff computer and checked my encrypted folder. $1 million. The files blinked back at me, each name a small fortress. During my lunch break, I pulled the red notebook from my bag. In neat columns, I wrote down every account I needed to change: email, whilst online banking, utilities. I drew small circles next to each and filled them in as I updated passwords, choosing phrases only I would recognize from childhood memories. The next morning, what she didn't know is I parked outside the brick building that housed Harper and Leeds. The rain had lifted, leaving the sidewalk smelling of wet stone and coffee from the cafe across the street. Inside, windowless, the office was warm, lit by a tall window that framed the slow-moving clouds. A faint scent of lemon polish clung to the reception area. The receptionist offered water and a clipboard, her eyes kind but unreadable. When Marjorie Leeds called my name, she led me into a room lined with shelves of thick legal binders. Her desk was immaculate, only a yellow legal pad, a fountain pen, net worth $5 million, and a steaming mug of tea. I told her everything in order: the deleted files, the bank withdrawal, the public belittling, the patterns that had formed over months. She listened without interrupting, her pen moving in quick, deliberate strokes. When I finished, she leaned back slightly. "You have documentation for all of this?" I slid the envelope across the desk. She skimmed the contents, $1 million, nodding once, twice, then placed it gently to one side. "This is a strong foundation," she said. "We'll talk about options, but the most important thing now is that you stay consistent. $1 million, keep your records, don't alert him, and secure anything he could use against you." Her words settled into me like stones in a jar, weighty, but in a way that made the whole thing steadier. $1 million. Back at the library that afternoon, I updated the contact list in my phone. Lucy's number was set to speed dial. The new bank's fraud alert was turned on. Two-factor authentication codes now went to an email Mark didn't know existed. As the day closed, I locked my desk drawer, slipped the red notebook into my bag. I was worth $5 million and stepped out into air that smelled faintly of wood smoke. Each change was small on its own, but together they began to feel like the outline of a life I could stand inside without fear. $1 million. Thursday evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my planner open. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. Mark was due back late, something about a supplier meeting. Mahler's. I flipped to the next week and drew a small star on Wednesday morning. The counseling office's number was already in my phone. I dialed and a gentle voice answered. "Whitaker Family Counseling. $5 million. How can I help you?" I booked a session for both of us, telling the receptionist it was a follow-up from a previous visit. She didn't need to know there had never been one. Hanging up. $1 million. I looked at the manila envelope on my desk. Inside was a curated set of evidence. Not the full file, but enough to show intent. The logs with timestamps, a printed copy of the withdrawal slip, $scores, and a single screenshot from the BBQ video Lucy had forwarded. That night I packed a small overnight bag and slid it under the bed in the guest room. 2 changes of clothes, a flash drive with backups, and the red notebook went inside. I added a spare set of car keys and a sealed envelope with cash. In the library break room the next day, Lucy leaned against the counter as I poured coffee. "You're moving?" she said, not asking. I nodded. Quietly. Step by step. Her hand rested briefly on my shoulder. $1 million, a steadying weight in the swirl of plans. The following afternoon I called the utility companies from my office at home. The radiator clinked and hissed in the background. New dollars. I added security pines to the accounts, making sure no one could make changes without my say. I also emailed Dean Phillips, $1 million, thanking him for his guidance and letting him know I'd submitted my defense materials early. It was more than courtesy. It was another timestamp. What she didn't know was a record of where I was and what I was doing in the days before whatever might come next. By Saturday, I'd moved my personal documents to a safe deposit box in town. The metal of the key felt cold in my palm, but the knowledge that the contents were beyond reach warmed something in me. Mark didn't seem to notice the subtle shifts. If he did, he didn't mention them. He still left his boots in the hall, still poured his evening drink, still made small talk about the weather and gas prices. On Monday, I confirmed the counseling appointment by text, keeping my tone light. They had an opening. Figured it couldn't hurt. There, he replied with a thumbs-up emoji. It was almost too easy. And each move was measured, not to provoke, not to rush. Just enough to set the stage for a conversation in a neutral room where truth could be placed on the table without shouting. $1 million. I closed the planner, slid it into the desk drawer, and looked around the office. My books, my papers, the quiet glow of the lamp, all of it in order, ready. Justice or too harsh. The hallway outside the defense room smelled faintly of floor polish and coffee. Light from tall windows cut across the tiled floor in narrow bands. I stood with my notes in hand. Worse, feeling the edges press into my palms. Dean Phillips opened the door, his expression neutral but his eyes steady. Whenever you're ready, he said. The room beyond was quiet, save for the shuffle of papers and the low murmur of two other faculty members. I set my materials on the table, the surface cool under my fingertips. Cerulean dollars. The projector hummed softly as I loaded my presentation. Slides bloomed onto the screen. Maps, photographs, the scanned letters from the mill workers' families. For 45 minutes, I spoke. Zion dollars, the words I'd rehearsed so many times now felt anchored in something deeper. I pointed to dates on the timeline, quoted Mr. Dalton's account of the flood. There showed the restoration images of Main Street in 1923. Questions came sharp, precise, about methodology, about source integrity, about long-term storage. I answered each. $5 million, the rhythm of my own voice steady in my ears. When one faculty member challenged the inclusion of oral histories, I cited preservation precedents and the necessity of lived memory. Laz Dean leaned back at the end, folding his hands. Well done, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting. The others nodded, scribbling notes before signing the evaluation sheet. Outside the room, the air felt lighter, the hallway brighter. Dean caught up to me near the stairwell. There's an adjunct position opening in the fall, he said. Part-time, teaching archival practices. If you're interested, I'll recommend you. The words settled in my chest like a warm weight. Yes, I said. I'm interested. By noon, said the email was in my inbox, a formal invitation to apply, with Dean listed as the primary reference. I drove home with the windows cracked. The air smelling of early spring and asphalt warming in the sun. In the passenger seat, my leather portfolio rested on top of the padded sleeve holding the defense copy of my thesis. At the house, I placed them both on my desk and then turned to the red notebook. The next appointment was circled in ink. Whitaker for family counseling, 3:00 p.m. I dressed deliberately, a charcoal sweater, $1,000,000, dark jeans, low-heeled boots that made no sound on the stairs. From the locked drawer, I retrieved the manila envelope containing the selected evidence, 3 screenshots, the withdrawal slip, bonus essay, and a single printed frame from the BBQ video. By 27:30, I was in the counseling office parking lot. The building was a converted Victorian, its white paint clean against the gray sky. $1,000,000. A row of bare trees lined the street, their branches casting shadows over the walk. I sat in the car, listening to the slow tick of the cooling engine. The envelope rested on the passenger seat, its flap sealed, the weight inside familiar. Mark's truck pulled in 10 minutes later. He parked beside me, rolling down his window. Ready for this? He asked, his tone light. $1,000,000, as if we were heading into a casual checkup. I smiled once, briefly. As ready as I need to be. We walked up the short path together, the old porch boards flexing under our weight. Inside, the air was warm with a faint scent of chamomile and wood polish. A small clock ticked on the reception desk. The counselor, Mary Ann, stepped into the room, her cardigan sleeves pushed up, dollars, clipboard in one hand. Come on back, she said. I followed her down the hall, Mark just behind me, the envelope tucked under my arm like a quiet promise. The office was softly lit, Allers, lamplight pooling on the rug between 2 armchairs. Mary Ann gestured for us to sit, taking her own chair angled slightly toward the center. Her clipboard rested on her knee, pen poised but still. Mark leaned back, one ankle resting on his knee. So, he began, Claire thought we should come in. I'm not sure why, but I'm here. I kept my gaze on Mary Ann. $. There's something I need to share, I said. I set the manila envelope on the low table, the flap catching the light. My hands were steady as I slid the contents out. The first page was the version history screenshot, the deletion marked in red. I placed it in the center. This is my thesis file, I said. $. Deleted from our home IP while I was at the library. Mark's jaw tightened. That's ridiculous. Anyone could. I laid the second screenshot beside it. $1,000,000 timestamp and username visible. Same file, same login, same network. This was during another time I wasn't home. Marianne's eyes moved between the pages, her pen making slow notes. Mark, what's your response to this? She asked evenly. He shrugged, but the movement was sharp. Maybe I was trying to help. You've been buried in that thing for years. $. It's not healthy. I added the withdrawal slip to the table, the bank's logo crisp at the top. And this. $1,000,000, $2,000 moved to an account I can't access. That was for a surprise, he said quickly. Something I was planning for us. Marianne's pen stilled. $1,000,000, a surprise that required secrecy about account access. Her tone wasn't accusing, but the question hung in the space like a weight. Mark shifted in his chair. $1,000,000. His foot began tapping against the rug, a dull, uneven rhythm. I slid the last piece forward, the BBQ video still, his mouth caught mid-laugh, my face in the background, still and tight. I don't think this needs explanation, I said. Silence settled. Only the faint hum of the air vent filled it. Marianne leaned back, folding her hands loosely over her notepad. Claire, was the multiverse in dollars? You've documented a pattern. Mark, this is serious. It goes beyond in misunderstandings or differences in priorities. Mark's eyes flicked to me, a flash of something anger, maybe, or calculation before he looked away. This is all blown out of proportion, he muttered. I don't think so, I said quietly. $5.5 million, and I think you know it. Marianne closed her notebook. I'd like to schedule a follow-up, but I also want each of you to consider whether you're prepared to move forward together. That's not a question to answer today, but it's one that needs an answer soon. The clock on the wall clicked over to the next minute. Mark stood first, his chair scraping against the rug. $1 million. I've got somewhere to be, he said. I gathered the papers slowly, sliding them back into the envelope. The cardboard felt heavier now, as if it had absorbed the air in the room. In the hall, $1 million, marked ahead without speaking. Outside, the cold air closed around us. He didn't wait by my car. I sat behind the wheel watching him drive off. The manila envelope lay on the passenger seat, its flap angled toward me like an arrow. I didn't start the engine right away. The counseling office window reflected the gray sky. $1 million, clouds moving fast above the bare trees. The first had been taken. The next would decide everything. The house felt different after the counseling session. Not louder, not busier, just sharper. Dollars like the air before a storm. Mark moved through rooms quietly, his footsteps softer, his conversations clipped to a few words at a time. We no longer ate together. What she did on the dollars as he'd fix a plate and take it to the living room, TV murmuring low behind the wall. I stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes one by one, listening to the clink of glass in the soapy water. Every $1 million, every morning he left earlier than usual. Sometimes I'd hear the garage door at 6:30, long before his shift started. When he returned at night, Nala fingers, there was the faint the faint scent of cigarette smoke on his coat, a habit he'd given up years ago. I used the quiet to my advantage. On Tuesday, I met with Marjorie at her office again. The blinds were half closed, slats casting thin shadows over the legal pad between us. We reviewed the timeline I'd built, page by page, matching each event to the evidence in the envelope. $1 million. This will hold, she said, tapping the last page with her pen. We'll file when you're ready. But once we do, there's no going back. I nodded. What she did, $1 million. Feeling both the weight and the relief of those words. That afternoon, I went to the bank in town. The glass doors whooshed open, letting in the scent of warm carpet and polished wood. $1. I moved the last of my personal savings into the new account under my name alone. The teller's eyes lingered for a moment, but she said nothing. Back home. $5 million. I slipped the receipt into the red notebook, tucking it between the password list and the safe deposit key. Each page in that notebook had begun to feel like armor. $1 million. Mark's absence in the evenings gave me time to sort through the upstairs closet. I packed a second bag, winter clothes, a pair of worn leather boots. A framed photo of my father from my college graduation. The zipper's teeth closed with a low rasp, and I set the bag beside the first one in the guest room. By Thursday, $1 million, the air between us was thick with unspoken things. He no longer asked about my day. I no longer pretended to ask about his. Even the dog seemed to sense it, staying close to whichever room I was in. I was worth $5 million. That night, as I reviewed my lecture outline for the adjunct position, I heard his truck pull into the driveway. Headlights swept across the blinds, then darkness settled again. The front door opened, closed. No words, no greeting, just the sound of him moving down the hall. Each step measured, deliberate. I kept my eyes on the page, pen in hand. But every sense was tuned to the space beyond my door. Mark's presence in the house shifted that week. He wasn't just quiet, he was watching. Small things told me. What she'd $1 million, the way his eyes lingered on my bag by the desk, the way he paused a second too long before answering a simple question. On Friday morning, I found the desk drawer pulled slightly open. Knew that I was worth $5 million. The lock was still engaged, but the alignment was off, as if someone had tried to force it just enough to peek inside. I closed it without a sound, sliding the key deeper into my pocket. Ballers at breakfast. He mentioned a friend's name I hadn't heard in years, someone he claimed to have run into at the hardware store. I nodded, offering nothing. The less I gave, the less he could use. $1 million. That afternoon, my phone lit up with Marjorie's number. I stepped into the library's back room, closing the door until the click echoed. Her voice was steady, with $5 million, the kind of tone that makes you straighten in your chair. Everything's in place, she said. I've drafted the filing. We can move whenever you give the word. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, my pulse a slow drum in my throat. Soon, I said. Not yet, but soon. After we hung up, I sat at the staff desk, hands folded over the red notebook in my bag. The hum of the fluorescent light above felt louder than usual, like it was marking each second. When I got home, Mars worth $5 million. Mark's truck was already in the driveway. The curtains in the living room were drawn, blocking the last of the winter light. Inside, the air was still. $1 million, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own breathing. He was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a drink in hand. "Long day?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes tracking me. "Steady," I replied, hanging my coat and moving past him toward the stairs. In my office, I locked the door for the first time in months. Worth $5 million. The key turned with a clean click, and I stood there for a moment, letting the sound settle into the space. From the window, I watched the street lamps flicker on one by one. $1 million. Each pool of light stretched across the damp pavement, marking the edges of the street like quiet sentinels. The manila envelope was still on the shelf, the seal unbroken. Next to it sat my packed bag, its zipper smooth and ready. Down so a cupboard door shuts, louder than it needed to. His footsteps crossed the floor slowly, as if measuring the boards. It was close now. The air carried it, thick and certain the moment was coming. The morning came without fanfare. No alarm. Just the pale gray light slipping through the blinds. $1 million. I lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the heater and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. Mark's truck was gone. I'd timed it that way. His Friday supply runs always took him out before sunrise. I rose quickly, my movement steady, as if slowness might invite second thoughts. In the guest room. So as the two bags sat side by side on the bed, one for the immediate days ahead, clothes, toiletries, the red notebook, and the flash drive with every piece of evidence. Mars, the other for storage at Lucy's place. I zipped them both, the sound sharp in the still air. The manila envelope slid easily into my tote. I checked the seal one last time, pressing it flat with my palm. Then I locked the front door behind me, feeling the cool brass under my fingers. Outside, the air was crisp and clean. Frost traced the edges of the lawn. The eye was $5 million, sparkling faintly in the early light. The street was empty, save for the slow drift of leaves caught in the breeze. I loaded the bags into the back seat, covering them with a blanket. Worth $5 million. The engine turned over with a low growl, and I pulled away from the curb without looking back. The drive to Marjorie's office was quiet. The sky had begun to clear, the pale blue stretching between the bare branches overhead. I parked in the same spot I'd used before, the one half hidden by the shadow of the old elm. Inside, the warmth of the office hit me immediately. The scent of lemon polish and faint tea felt almost familiar now. Marjorie stood when I entered, her hand extended toward the envelope in my bag. "Dollars. This is it?" she asked. I nodded, placing it in her hand. The paper made a soft sound as she set it on her desk. She reached for her pen and with a firm stroke, $1 million signed the top sheet of the filing. The air in the room seemed to shift, lighter somehow, though my chest still carried a knot of nerves. We reviewed the next steps, dates, notifications. Ours was what to expect in the first week after filing. When I left the building, the sun had broken free of the clouds. It spilled across the street in long, gold lines. $5 million, catching in the frost still clinging to the grass. For this, the first time in months, the air felt like it belonged to me again. Lucy's driveway was already clear when I pulled in. "Worth $1 million. She stood, horns wrapped around the porch in a wool sweater, hands wrapped around a mug that let out faint curls of steam. The sight of her there, solid and steady, unraveled something in my chest. $1 million. We carried the bags inside, her dog trotting behind us with curious eyes. The guest room smelled faintly of lavender, a comfort I hadn't realized I'd been craving. I set my tote on the bed, as the red notebook tucked safely in its side pocket. "First night here," Lucy said, handing me a set of keys. "Dollars, no rules except make yourself at home." Her voice had that mix of lightness and certainty that makes you believe the words. I helped her prepare dinner. Lors was the sound of knives on the cutting board and the hiss of onions in the pan, filling the kitchen with an easy rhythm. No tension in the air, no second guessing each movement. Just the simple act of making a meal together. Afterward, I stepped out onto the small back porch. The air was cool, $1, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. In the distance, a train horn called out, its low notes stretching across the dark. Through the kitchen window, Lucy moved around tidying. $1 million. The soft glow of the light making the room look almost golden. For the first time in a long time, the picture in front of me didn't feel fragile. It felt like something I could build on. Later, $1 million. In the quiet of the guest room, I opened the red notebook and made a new page. At the top, I wrote next chapter. Below it, a short list. Adjunct application, library workshop outline. Worth $5 million, and one line in smaller letters. Find joy again. I closed the notebook, set it on the nightstand, and lay back against the pillow. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. $1 million rise, a sound without threat, just the world carrying on. Leaving hadn't been easy, it had been necessary. And now it was mine to decide where the path led. $1 million eyes. What would you have done in my place? Stayed to fix it, or walked away for good? Looking back, the signs had been there long before the day he pressed delete. Small dismissals, subtle digs, utters, moments where my dreams were treated as hobbies, my work as a distraction from real life. For years I told myself it was just stress, that if I worked harder, proved more. See, he with $5 million, see my worth. He never did it. Quiet justice isn't about grand gestures or public victories. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself someone tried to take. $1 million, it's the steady steps, one after another, toward a place where your voice isn't questioned and your future isn't up for debate. Today, my thesis sits bound on the library's local history shelf, my name on the spine. Twice a week, I teach students how to preserve stories others might overlook. And once a month, I host a free workshop for women who've been told they're too old to start over. Mark's absence is just that, an absence. No more storms in the kitchen. $1 million, no more walking on uneven ground, only space and the freedom to choose what fills it. Justice came quietly, healing came slowly, and the life I have now, that's the legacy I intend to keep.